So, welcome back to another episode of the Rep by Rep Strength Podcast. Today, I'm sitting down with Dr. Tim Suchomel, Associate Professor at Carroll University in field of movement sciences. So, Doc, thanks for taking time to sit down with me today and answer some questions that I've been thinking of. But just first and foremost, I've seen, you have a new book out that just came out 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, just not too long ago, probably within the last month or so.
Okay, so new book, and what's the focus on that book? What's it trying to cover here?
Yeah, it's a strength and conditioning textbook. It's conditioning in sports from science to practice, and what we try to do is integrate a lot of the sports science side of things. So yes, conditioning textbook, but we also talk about how to integrate sports science, the monitoring, etc., with the periodization concepts, the programming concepts, but also we still have the neuromuscular physiology in there, ergonomics.
Gotcha. And then who else did you collaborate with on this one?
Yeah, Dr. Mike Stone was the lead on it. Then it was me. We had Dr. Guy Hornsby, Dr. Hegel, and Dr. Aaron Cunanan.
All right. So some big names there, and everybody's doing big things at different organizations and whatnot, right? Because you've got Doc Stone still doing his thing down in ETSU.
Still doing his thing.
God, is he? I don't know if he's ever going to retire, right? Like
he'll in quotes retire. I'm sure he's still going to be involved for life.
And then Dr. Hornsby, is he out at West Virginia still?
Dr. Hornsby at West Virginia. John Wagle is now AD or assistant AD, I can't remember, at University of Notre Dame. He's performance there. And then Aaron Cunanan, I can't remember his title, but I know the high up in the sports science side of the Cincinnati.
Okay. So, I think just so whoever's listening to this has a little bit of context of how you and I know each other is I met you when I was at University of Wisconsin La Crosse, and that was where I was first introduced to what I think most people know you for is, Olympic lift variations and how they can be implemented. Can you kind of explain how you got into that, and then, how's that evolved over the years?
So I did my master's thesis project looking at 3 different variations of a hang clean. We compared the differences in, force, velocity, power, what have you, across a spectrum of loads with the hang power clean, the jump shrug, and the hang high pull. Basically, the project was to look at, are there differences between pulling variations and catching variations when it came to instantaneous peak variables, which at the time I didn't really comprehend how much data we actually had. So continuing on with that project, after the first couple papers were published, we looked at it more in a continuous fashion. So we were looking at force time like entire force time records, power time records. But then that has spurred into a variety of other things, looking at, we'll call it load acceptance. So the braking side of things after the catch or coming down from the pull, et cetera, landing with the jump shrug. We also did some collaborations with Dr. Paul Comfort out in University of Salford. And that has turned into a variety of projects being studied, looking at versus pulling. The first one we did with Paul Comfort, 8 weeks in season training with what you would term submaximal loads. Same loading between a catch and a pull group. Really, there were no differences between either group from a statistical or a practical standpoint. And the take-home message there was you can use either and still achieve the same benefits. which highly identifies that gray area when it comes to, it's not necessarily one or the other. You can still achieve the exact same benefits, of assuming that the loading is going to be near identical. Now, that's turned into a project to examine the impact of what if the loads weren't identical. We know with pulling variations that certain variations we can use over 100% of our catching variations. So an example would be something like the pull from the floor, counter movement shrug, hang pull. We've examined loads with a couple of variations upwards to 140% of someone's 1RM. And what we ended up doing was we did a 10-week training study, did a strength endurance block, 3 sets of 10, 4-week strength block, general strength, 3 sets of 5. We did an overreach, we did a taper. And what we did was we still had 2 groups that were catching and pulling biomechanically similar variations. So if it's a power clean from the floor, it's a pull from the floor with the pull group. Then we had a 3rd group that we used phase-specific loading with pulling variations. For example, you have pulls from the floor with the pull group, but you had pulls from the floor with the overload group with an additional 20% on the bar. So what you're doing is you're emphasizing the force component of it so that we can basically provide a force overload when we can within specific phases. So within a strength phase, when you really want to emphasize the ceiling of force production using semi-ballistic or ballistic variations, we can use pretty heavy loads and accomplish that. But then on the flip side of things, when we went to a taper, we switched it where we're trying to provide a velocity overload where we're using loads as low as 20% of their 1RM with a really ballistic variation like a jump shrug or a hang high pull, really to emphasize the velocity side of things. So the whole idea was to provide both a force and velocity overload over the course of the entire training study. And what we ended up finding was the limitation of it was that it was only 10 weeks. Now, from a performance standpoint, we saw greater increases in 1RM power clean, sprint, that's 10, 20, and 30 meters, change direction, isometric mid-thigh pull peak force, all with this overload group. In terms of jumping performance, it was back and forth between the pull group and the overload group when it came to pulls. But generally speaking, pulls came out on top depending on the variation that we were looking at. Muscle architecture, we have a paper in review right now that looked at some muscle architecture, and there really weren't any differences between each individual group. So basically what that tells us is that the same muscle architecture changes are likely happening between each of the groups. Now, keep in mind, these were the weightlifting variations we were using were not the only things that were programmed. We still squatted, we still benched, we still did overhead variations, we did rows, pull-ups, etc. So we tried to make it a very economical program in the sense that this is something people can use without only doing weightlifting variations. So this was really for team sport athletes that have, well-rounded programs with squat, press, pulls, etc. But it's really interesting where some of that is going. So the current project that we're in the process of, we're collecting women's data, but we also have men's data already, where we're trying to figure out the best way how to load pulling variations without having to do a 1RM catch. So that's a project that we're working on now. We have loads anywhere from 20 upwards to 140% with certain variations. Looking at a jump shrug, high pull, hang power clean, hang pull, counter movement shrug, with 3 different velocity devices on the bar, standing on a force plate. So yeah, we have a lot of data coming out within the next few months here, hopefully.
Okay. So you guys have been
That
busy.
was a really long-winded answer to where this has all gone.
No,
so it all started with basic comparisons and is now gone into how can we practically implement this the best that we can, with a variety of equipment that people may use for velocity-based training, etc.
Yeah, and I think that's where I really appreciate what you guys do as far as it's not like you're just collecting data for the sake of collecting data. Like you're actually implementing this, but then also you guys are all practitioners of, hey, we're going to go and actually coach and get in the weight room and apply, and we're going to see how this will integrate so that we can relay it to coaches. Because that's one of the big things I do, like on my side working with the tactical population, is a lot of these guys are beat up and have a bad wrist, bad shoulder, whatever, or hey, I don't want to risk turning over a clean and potentially have an issue on the collarbone or whatever. So that's where I'll use a lot of what you and I have talked about before as far as loading parameters go. With, hey, we're going to do pulls from high blocks, we're going to do snatch grip high pulls or jump shrugs or whatever, and maybe sometimes it's a trap bar jump shrug or whatever, but we're still getting the benefit of the triple extension. It's just loaded differently based on where they're at and what they've got going on. And it works out really well. And I would love to have these guys long enough where I could teach them to be very proficient with a snatch and a clean and jerk. But, as I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times, it's, I don't always have the time, or I can't do this. So that's why I love the variance. So, but
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the phrases that I use, and we published in a paper in NSCA Coach, was learning to catch while pulling. And the idea is that your pulling variations may serve as your primary training stimulus in the time that you're teaching someone how to perform a catch, with some extra drills on the side. Then you have some complexes that you may involve within set complexes, between set complexes, etc., before you're doing full sets of doing catching variations. And really what you're doing is making sure that the pull is, proficient before you're adding in the complexity of a catch. Now, for better, for worse, that's the way we do it. But there's more than one way to accomplish the same goal. We've just found success this way.
Mm-hmm. And when let's see, on my notes, one thing I wanted to get your go ahead and break down, because I hear these terms used interchangeably all the time, and there is clear differences between periodization and programming. Can you please go ahead and give your breakdown there?
Well, programming simply is your X's and Y's. Basically, what you are programming, your exercise choice, your sets, your reps, your rest periods, the loads that you're using, your intensities, however you want to prescribe that. You could also say that within an individual phase, you have heavy and light. So that's a concept that that we'll use throughout a week. Periodization is the much larger overview of it. It's the planning. It's planned phasic variation throughout an entire training year or macro cycle. You could obviously have a quad, so multiple years, but the idea is that it's a plan. So you have a bigger view of what the overall plan is. When you have to be at your peak at this time. When you have to be when you can recover at this time. So it's planned variation for optimizing performance and optimizing recovery, so that the individual, whether sport, event, profession, can be as proficient and effective as possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary and explanation of what it is we're trying to do. Is a couple concepts that I'll talk to these guys about. Is getting them to understand, like you just mentioned, you have heavy days and light days. Getting them to understand not every day can be redlined, is the term I use. Of if we look at Bondarchuk and Assurin and saying you've got a point scale, a 1 through 5 point scale, I'll give them the concept of, like, we roughly have 15 to 20 points that we can use within a week, but you can't just stack 4 or 5 point days within a week and expect good things to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there's a time and a place to go hard. There's a time and a place to back off, and day to day, that can fluctuate. So when we say heavy and light can talk about a phase. It can talk about a week. It can talk about a day. It can talk about a single exercise.
Mhm.
Realistically, so but also integrating this idea of heavy and light. This is where some people come up with the idea of force and velocity. Your hard days are your force days, your lighter days are your velocity days. But realistically, it comes down to how well that person is moving on that particular day, which is why monitoring is so important. Whether you're using VBT, whether you're using counter movement jumps for readiness or something along the lines of readiness questionnaires. But yeah, the importance of monitoring is really going to dictate when we can go heavy and when we can, or when we need to go light, I should say.
Yeah, and that was one that Dr. Tabor, him and I were talking. He said, just use a just jump mat, because I was telling him what we have access to is we currently have 3 just jump mats, and we just got some balled force plates, which I don't know enough about those yet to use them. But anyway, with the just jump mats, we'll jump, and then we have just a stoplight system of green, yellow, red, and then based on the percentage drop off, there we go. And
Yeah, it doesn't have to be any more fancy than that. I know our GA with soccer right now will use weekly jumps on a just jump for, he'll use the 4 jump protocols to see how quick they're getting off the ground in relation to how high they're jumping. And he'll use that as a kind of a fatigue monitoring tool.
mhm. And now, what have you noticed when you're referring to force and velocity there? Are there people who will try to integrate both of those within a day, and then or within a training session? And if so, does that work out well, or does it work out better to have force has its own day, velocity has its own day?
I mean, the phase is going to dictate what you're going to end up doing, but also the phase itself is going to dictate what exercise and load combinations you need. So when people refer to force and velocity, they often refer to load velocity rather than force velocity. And what I mean by that is, let's take sprinting, for example. Sprinting, there are really fast velocities. We know that because it wouldn't be sprinting otherwise. But what people also need to understand is that there are really high forces created during sprinting. So just because it's someone's body weight doesn't mean there aren't high forces. So you almost have to think of it as each type of exercise. So we'll say sprinting, loaded jumps, unloaded jumps, resistance training, your typical traditional movements, squat, press, pull, weightlifting variations. You could even go into eccentric variations, have their own, force velocity spectrum, if you will.
Mhm.
Um, Now, force is going to be dictated oftentimes by the load. Heavier loads typically require higher forces, but at the same time, velocity may then be dictated by how quickly we create that force or the rate of force development. Now, the velocity, we just have to be careful that we understand what velocity we're actually referring to.
Mhm.
When you put a gym aware or tendo unit or something on the bar, you're obviously measuring barbell velocity. Now, with a movement like a squat, bench press, a row, um, you're typically not measuring anything different from what the system would actually achieve within that movement. Now, when I say system, I'm referring to the athlete or the lifter plus the weight that they're moving.
Okay.
But if I do a weightlifting variation, a clean or something, the bar travels independently from the body. So when I'm doing a snatch, the system, myself and the bar, is going to reach its peak velocity right when I achieve that triple extension. But the barbell velocity will continue because the bar is still a far. This is a reason you see higher peak barbell velocities compared to system velocities when you're comparing these variations. We have some data on that right now, where it's interesting to look at a high pull and a jump shrug in terms of barbell velocity. They're very similar. They're very similar. But if you compare the system velocities, they're not even close. The jump shrug, which is a true ballistic movement that you're jumping off the ground, achieves a high quote barbell velocity because the system is moving fast. But a high pull achieves a high barbell velocity because the bar has to travel a much longer distance. So it's interesting to go and compare the differences between the two, because while they may achieve the same barbell velocity, the system is completely different. So it becomes what velocity is going to be the most important for the individuals. Now, most of the time, team sport athletes, tactical, are probably more concerned with system velocity than they are with barbell velocity. To be clear, that doesn't mean barbell velocity is not important. It just means that the transfer that we're typically looking for with a weightlifting variation, for example, is probably more with system velocity than barbell.
Yeah. Yeah, I can absolutely see that. As far as I would agree. I think these guys would care a lot more about the system. I was talking to one of them last week, and he was showing me different positions that he'll have to get in for his work. And, this guy weighs 225. And I think when he's fully kitted up, he said he gets, it's a total system load of 285 pounds. So he said, if a guy, if he's out, wherever he's deployed to, and a guy goes down and he has to rescue that guy or drag him out of a dangerous situation, he has to still be able to get his 285 pounds into crazy positions. And then he also has to be able to pull out that, call it 185-pound guy who's also fully kitted up. So now what's our total weight between those two? And then how do you maintain mobility and strength through that entire range of motion for a potentially dangerous situation? So,
right.
And him and I are on the absolute same page as far as I think more people need to understand how important absolute strength is to everything else that we do. Because if the absolute strength is so low that, A, can you move that person? And B, if you can move them, are you going to risk your own health later on? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, team sport athletes or even individual sport athletes don't really comprehend what tactical individuals have to go through in terms of, like you mentioned, the absolute strength side of things. Like, heaven forbid, we have a soldier, officer, firefighter, whatever, on the ground, and we need to drag them out of harm's way. If you have a small individual, relative strength is important, don't get me wrong, but being able to move that person is a task that needs to be able to occur. So no doubt about it that absolute strength is going to be important to these individuals.
And we'll have our days where, I know guys will break down their training weeks a little different, but we have two primary days that are most important in a week. We have a day where it's dedicated to more like, hey, we're going to lift fairly heavy today, and a day where it's dedicated to more higher velocity, ballistic type movements. And, we'll do things like jumping and throwing med balls, et cetera, et cetera. But part of it too is like, hey, if you come up to a wall and you've got to throw some stuff over the wall and then get your body up, if we haven't practiced that, now we're in trouble,
Yeah.
So do you guys, is there anything you've done to play around with any kind of jumping or med ball activity, or is it, what have you noticed there?
I mean, typically when it comes to loaded jumps, unloaded jumps, med ball throws, they're generally going to be faster than our weightlifting variations. Weightlifting variations are certainly fast, but again, this is the constant Twitter battle that it's always out there. Should I use a weightlifting variation, or should I use a hex bar jump? The answer is yes. You can use. I mean, seriously, it's I don't know why.
Yeah.
I don't know why we have to be on one side or the other. If you're asking me, I'm going to use both of them because I personally think, and I know from our data that we compared jump shrugs versus hex bar jumps versus jump squats. What we ended up finding is that a jump shrug is going to produce more force at peak power compared to a hex bar jump and a jump squat. So you could make the argument that the velocity achieved by something like a hex bar jump is going to generally be higher than a jump shrug variation, which you could debate is one of the fastest, if not the fastest, weightlifting variation. So it's not an either or for me, it's a win. I'm going to use hex bar jumps when I need to achieve a really high velocity. Again, that doesn't mean I'm not doing weightlifting variations at the same time. It's a combination of what I need and when, or I should say what my athletes need and when. So if I'm in a speed strength phase, I'm like, I need fast exercises. What am I going to use? Well, if I know that they're probably already sprinting, they're probably already doing change of direction stuff. I need a lightly loaded jump that's going to help them move fast. At the same time, in order to maintain high force output, high rate of force development, maybe I'm going to use a jump shrug in addition to that as more of I'll call it a strength speed exercise compared to, more of a speed strength exercise and load combination, which we do with a hex bar.
Right. So,
And to answer your original question, we that's generally what we see is that loaded jumps, unloaded jumps, med balls are faster. So than our weightlifting variations. So we will incorporate them on our lighter type days to really emphasize and exploit that velocity that we can get out of them.
So for reference here, when you're saying fast, are we talking like 2-3 meters per second? I mean, is that kind of in the ballpark?
Yeah, so system velocity of a jump shrug at about 20% of 1 RM. Now I'm basing this off of the men's data. Women's data is a little bit slower. The highest that we've seen, 20%, 0%, and that was just with a PVC pipe. Well, we'll see system velocities of like 2.6 meters per second on a jump shrug. Again, we've had people achieve 2.8, I think was the highest that we had with that individual. That was a former sprinter. But with a hex bar at 0 to 20, we're nearing right around 3 meters per second. So we're certainly a little bit higher. I think the peak that we had on that was probably 3.1. But I'd have to go back and examine more. But generally speaking, you're looking at probably about 2.2 meters per second on the peak side of things. And velocity at peak power compared to something like a jump shrug.
Okay, and just for context, so people can understand the reference here, and I know it'll break down like if we're talking like absolute versus strength, speed strength, etc. But let's just say like an absolute strength squat. How slow is that going to move relative? Is that going to be 0.5 meters per second or 0.3?
Yeah. So you can get power lifters. I had someone do a 1 RM back squat where this is mean velocity. Mean velocity, they were moving like 0.17 meters per second. Now their peak is obviously higher than that. So you're going to be, 0.3, a little, 0.5, depending on kind of how they pop at the top. And once they get through that stick point, but yeah, mean velocity of a back squat, the lowest I've seen was, I think it was 0.15, 0.17 meters per second. Now, if you put that into perspective, 15 centimeters per second, 30 centimeters is a foot. So, I mean, they're crawling through that thing.
Right.
I know Brian Mann has said that he's had some power lifters that are lower than that even. I mean, they can grind. You just have the people that can just grind out of that, and there's other people who can't. So, Yeah, but that's mean velocity. The ones I was listing were peak velocity.
Okay. And that's the other thing that I talk to these guys about is, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on it, but how frequently do we need to touch, max strength? How frequently do we need to touch this stuff so that we retain it or develop it or do whatever it is we want to do? And oftentimes they think they need to touch it more frequently than it actually is.
Sure.
But what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's some work going on with professional soccer right now where they're looking at microdosing and how often you should be exposed to it. Now, I know from a sprinting standpoint, we try to have our athletes exposed to max velocity once a week, possibly. Again, possibly when they're in season, it's generally going to happen. A lot of the time, whether in matches or while they're in practice, etc. Now, from a max strength standpoint, generally speaking, from my understanding, we can expose someone to relatively high loads once a week. And they should be able to maintain their strength. Strength is interesting because it sticks around for a long period of time, assuming that you built it over a long period of time. But the speed and the rate of force development, that explosiveness is generally the first thing to go, but max strength hangs in there for a while. But you're looking at wanting to touch loads, above 80% of that 1 RM. Even if you can do it, once per week, you should be able to maintain that for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard some speculation. I don't know how true it is as to why we hang on to strength, and I think aerobic endurance also has a relatively long residual. And speculative speculation is that go back to hunter gatherer times; those were the two most important qualities that we had to retain. But again, I don't know if that's actually accurate or if it's just
that'd be an interesting book. I'd read that one. I'd read that one. There you go. That's your book right there.
Let's see. But yeah, so those were the big points I was wanting to touch on. So we've already talked monitoring. Yep, cool. Now, as far as I did have a couple specific questions because I talked to these guys and I was like, hey, I'm going to be doing this podcast with Dr. Suchomel. Is there anything you'd like to know more about? So one of the questions that I was thinking of when you were talking about system load versus barbell velocity. So one of those, I would assume with the system load, your whole body is going to leave the ground.
Not necessarily.
It doesn't have
Not necessarily. No, okay. I mean, you can get system velocity during a squat. It just has to be recorded by something like a force plate. Can't necessarily get this from I think, well, I shouldn't say that. From a jump mat, there are some equations that are out there where you're able to get power, like the Seary equation. But there's obviously some corrections that need to be done with that just to make sure it's not overestimating. I've seen some kind of ridiculous power outputs from that equation sometimes, and I'm like, that's not even humanly possible. And here you have Joe Schmo doing a jump. Yeah, generally speaking, when I'm talking about system velocity, I'm measuring force output, and then I'm calculating an acceleration from changes in force data, and then I'm going to get a velocity from that. So you're basically working backwards from, well, I shouldn't say you're working forward dynamics to get that type of velocity, but also it kind of works the opposite way when you're measuring barbell velocity, because you are measuring a displacement. It's measuring time. So displacement in time is velocity. You can get an acceleration from that. And then velocity measurement devices like a GymAware, Tendo, et cetera, are estimating what the force is based on the load that's on the bar. The problem with that is you're not actually measuring force production. You are production. which is estimated from your velocity and the load used. So it's not perfect, but the nice thing is that Newton was a pretty smart guy. I like to say that Newton was our very first strength coach. He understood he had his laws and everything, and I'm like, yeah, he's just talking about force production and strength, which is why I always depict Newton with a handlebar mustache. Um, when he was in his lifting days. But yeah, I system velocity generally just comes from the force being produced and then calculating the acceleration and velocity of whatever's on that force plate.
Okay, because that was the other thing I was thinking of was, some of these guys are going to get deployed to different areas soon, and I guess two questions here is, if the only thing I can send them with is like, hey, I'm going to send you with some bands. How can we do anything with bands? And then secondly, if we don't have if they don't have a tendo unit or anything like that available, can they just do some markings on a wall, or can they jump for distance to measure from a monitor? How do they do this without any kind of tech available?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, jump height, as we know, is not the best measure of someone's fatigue, but it will give you something. Obviously, if someone's not achieving even close to what their peak jump height was, then obviously something from a neural standpoint's going on, or from a physical standpoint's going on. So jump height, well, it wouldn't be my first choice. It's certainly something that you jump up with a piece of chalk, you're marking it on the wall, or even if you have a sticky note. I know the very first vertical jump test we were learning were how do you do this without technology? And it was everyone had a sticky note, and you had to jump up and slap it on the wall. Even if you had, where you get like sand on your hand or something like that, or chalk or whatever, and you're able to get your handprint on the wall, so you know exactly kind of where you are, type of thing. There's certainly ways to do it. From a broad jump standpoint, I don't know as much about it, to be honest with you. We don't use consistent broad jumps for monitoring fatigue. It would be interesting to look at, especially with the sports that have more of a horizontal component to it. It'd be interesting to look at that in someone like a sprinter, someone who has to run a lot, just because they have to create horizontal forces. Granted, there's also a lot of vertical force production, because if they weren't producing vertical force, they just fall on their face. I mean,
Yeah.
it's so, I mean, it would be interesting to look at longitudinally. Now, again, you're looking at a distance. A distance can be achieved a couple different ways with a horizontal jump. The biggest thing I would probably send along with them is the idea that whatever you're using, just be consistent with it. Same conditions, footwear, the best that you can, because we know that take someone outside in Wisconsin during the winter and it's 20 below and say, do a vertical jump. One, they're going to look at me like, why am I outside right now? But at the same time, I can take them outside in the summer and it's 90 degrees with 90% humidity, or 100 degrees, and then say to do the same thing. Well, the body is already in a different physiological state. So the way that they perform may not be identical, but it's going to tell us something about where they are at the time.
Right. Yeah, that was another thing that's been getting a lot of traction recently, that I've been having more and more conversations with guys about, is addressing the footwear. Because these guys will be locked in boots, and there's different types of boots. Like I've learned more about boots over the past year than I've ever cared to know. But and the question comes up: well, my feet are killing me. How important is the footwear? What do I do to address it? And then how do I limit the number of contacts that I have so that my feet can recover, is a question that I get with these guys. So any tips or advice that you would have for them as far as what can we do without leaving the ground so we can take care of the feet?
I mean, you can do an upper body test. Again, they're on their feet most of the time, so if we're doing an upper body test, it's still feasible. Again, with something like this, you're trying to track a distance. So with our athletes, we do like a single arm med ball throw for
Okay.
distance on either side. Now you can do a seated one with both hands. So I mean, it'll probably give you a better idea of their overall system. But again, being strict on how they're performing it, when they're doing a seated med ball throw, making sure that their back is all the way up against a wall, because if they throw it out and they're leaning forward while they do it, it's obviously modifying the test. Now, other things, where they won't necessarily have to leave the ground is they may leave the ground a little bit, but even if you still have a med ball or some people use just a stone or a rock that they know approximately how heavy it is, where they're doing an overhead, an overhead shot throw basically, or an underhand shot throw just for distance again. Um, you know, Again, it's not ideal. But again, most of the conditions that they're in aren't ideal. So,
Right.
but again, the biggest thing I would probably emphasize with it is just consistency.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at this condition one time, you need to measure in that condition the best you can every time. Because otherwise you're not being able to compare the two measurements.
Yeah, that's one aspect that we will train a lot of is effectively we'll have a day that is odd object, and you know one side might be loaded differently than the other side, because in our weight room it's nice when we're inside and we have calibrated weights and we know everything weighs the same, but what happens when they head out in the field and they have to be put in positions to change, and then they're under load and it's all different, so doing what we can to prepare them that way, so
Just saw a picture recently come across social media of a soldier in a full squat, which was the shooting position. And I was just like, I wonder how many, and again, I don't know. They may still teach that shooting position in one time or another, but yeah, full squat, flat feet on the ground, knees are up to the guy's armpits,
yeah.
but he's still in a shooting position. So, yeah, it's interesting how things change year to year. Training practices obviously, hopefully, improve based on what we've learned previously. But yeah, consistency is the big thing. Whether it's training, whether it's monitoring, just trying to create the optimal conditions the best we can.
Yeah, 100%. That was and a few weeks ago I was down in Texas at their special warfare development area, and some things. The amount of data that they're taking in now is crazy. I mean, they have people who are data collection specialists, and then the team gets together and they discuss and be like, okay, what are we going to do now that we've collected this data? So I got to see the guys, with some straps that they had on their side, measuring their heart rate while they're in the water, and another group was doing recovery type cardio day, and they all had straps put on their side, and then they would collect that data at the end of the day. And uh, so seeing their heart rates while they're doing, you know they have to keep their hands out of the water and they have to tread, and
Hmm.
I'm over there hanging with the data guy, and I'm watching their heart rates just get to about 90 to 95% max heart rate, and they monitor it. Hey, we're going to do 4 to 5 of these. Good luck. And the other thing that they're finally um, getting more attention to is sleep from the recovery standpoint. Um, so making
I need
sure
to
that
do
these
that.
guys, yeah, I mean, I do what I can. Like I've got these blue light filter glasses and a blue light filter on my computer and all this stuff. But yeah, I mean, is there anything that we haven't heard or that you're finding out new that could help these guys out as far as sleep and recovery goes?
Sleep and recovery, it's admittedly it's not my realm, and unfortunately my practices when it comes to sleep are very poor. um you know but there's more and more data out there. obviously, the more sleep someone can get, the more effective they'll be the following day, the following week. The accumulation of a lack of sleep, which is kind of an oxymoron if you think about it. Poor sleep, chronic poor sleep is certainly going to lead to decrements in performance and even brain function. So, making sure that there's a good combination of nutrition, but also sleep at the same time is certainly going to lead to a more effective individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a study. Somebody posted it on LinkedIn, but it was just showing, the more sleep deprived you are, the more likely you are to have an injury.
Yeah, and there's some really good people out there when it comes to sleep research, and they'll be able to provide a lot better information on that than I could. No doubt about that.
Yeah, I'll need to talk with you later and get some of those names and see if I can refer those guys to who you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Her name is escaping me right now, but I just met her at a conference at Notre Dame. But yeah, we can certainly chat. I'll make sure that I'll get the name to you.
Cool. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. I think that covers about all the stuff that I was wanting to pick your brain about and discuss. Yeah, as far as I think that's one of the awesome things that you do, as far as you're pretty accessible on social media from what I've seen, especially on Twitter, and then putting out good stuff on Instagram. But where can people reach out more to get more information from you, and definitely plug your what other stuff you're working on, like your book and anything else you've got coming up, because I know a lot of guys will want to follow this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably on Twitter more than I am on Instagram, but the handle's still the same, Dr. T Suchomel. And if anybody reaches out to me, I'm happy to get back to you as quickly as I can. Some days, admittedly, it's a bad habit sometimes, but I'll read it. I'll in my head respond, but I won't actually respond. So bear with me as if that happens. I'm not doing it on purpose, I promise. But I'll try to get back to you the fast as we can. And on my Twitter page, if anyone is interested in our research, I have a link to my ResearchGate page. I think it might be on my Instagram too. I'm not sure, but that has all of our research on it. That I can post anyway. And if anybody has questions on that, happy to answer it. But also, I'll be able to tell you all what we're all working on. And I just remembered that name. So before I forget, Professor Shona, Australian Catholic University. She does some really good stuff when it comes to sleep research, and yeah, she's great. Had a nice chat with her at the Performance Summit. But Shona, Shona, and Halson, Halson.
Great. All right, and then name of the new book one more time.
Name of the new book is Strength and Conditioning in Sports: From Science to Practice.
Awesome. Yeah, I would highly recommend everybody check that out, because that's coming from some of the best in the game that did a collaboration, put this together. So, all right, Doc, thank you very much for your time, and I'll talk with you again soon.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, thanks.